Hey, everybody, welcome to Spark Sessions. I am your host, Lori Tyler. Marketing and sales have just one of those relationships in business that people love to joke about because marketing will say, we're doing great. We generated hundreds of leads. And sales will say, yeah, but none of them were any good. Marketing thinks sales is never following up, and sales thinks that marketing doesn't understand the sales process. It goes on and on. And sometimes it's subtle, and sometimes it can be a little more dramatic. And I have seen it occasionally show up in some awkward leadership meetings where the CEO is just looking back and forth between the head of marketing and the head of sales and just trying to figure out who's right. And over the course of my career, I've actually had really, truly wonderful relationships with the sales team. And some of the people that I've learned the most from about the business have been the sales leaders and the sales reps. I've sat in on pipeline meetings and I've listened to sales calls, and I've even had sales leaders pull me aside and say, can you help me think through this deal? And those moments ended up really shaping how I think about marketing more than almost anything else. Because when sales and marketing partner really well together, something very powerful will happen. Marketing will get much closer to the customer, and sales will get stronger messaging and better support. And the whole business just starts functioning more like a revenue team instead of two departments that are, occasionally just throwing side eye at each other. I've seen that the marketers who build the strongest partnerships with sales, they tend to become the most effective marketers in the organization, not because they just say yes to everything, not because they're just trying to make sales happy, but because they're learning from the people who are genuinely the closest to the customer. Sales experiences the business very differently than marketing. Marketing is usually looking at patterns. We're looking at campaign results and audience engagement and website behavior. We're studying groups of buyers and trying to figure out how they collectively behave. Sales is having individual conversations. They are hearing someone say, you know, I'm not sure that this solves my problem. They hear, we're going to compare you to another vendor, or they hear, well, thanks. This looks really interesting, but the timing's just not right. So they are living in this world of real time buyer conversations. And those conversations contain an enormous amount of insight. But in a lot of those organizations, sales and marketing don't spend as much time learning from each other. As marketers, we are busy running our campaigns, and sales is busy working on deals, and everyone is moving quickly. But before you know it, the two teams are just operating in silos. And we run off the tracks very quickly when we're not talking to each other. And we're all supposed to be working towards the same goal. But when we're not sharing what the other knows, it's a huge missed opportunity. And I still remember one of the first times early in my career, I sat in on a series of sales calls. And up until that point, marketing had built what we thought was a very clear story around the product. We had our messaging, we had our positioning, we had all the campaign materials. Everything looked great. Everything was just really buttoned up and we were ready to go. And then I listened to the conversations that the rep was actually having with customers. And something very quickly became obvious. The customers were describing their problems completely differently then we were describing them in our marketing. And it wasn't dramatically different, but it was enough that it mattered. They used different language and they emphasized different concerns. And they asked questions that we just hadn't anticipated. And the sales rep had to think on their feet and, spend time translating what we meant and what we were trying to say in our messaging that we had given them. And that was just a really important moment for me because it reminded me that marketing doesn't get to decide whether messaging is clear. The customer decides that. And sales is hearing feedback in real time. So, one of the most valuable things that I think marketers can do is simply spending time with the sales team, not just the leadership team, but the reps, the people that are talking to the buyers every single day. Sit in on discovery calls and watch how they run demos and listen to the questions that prospects ask and really pay attention to those moments where the conversation changes because those moments are incredibly revealing. You hear the hesitation in somebody's voice when they're not sure. And you hear the curiosity when something suddenly resonates. And you hear the exact objections that will show up again and again. And once you hear those conversations, it becomes almost impossible to go back to writing marketing messaging the same way because now you're understanding the buyer and you're understanding that what their reality is and that your messaging needs to be grounded in that reality. And sales teams, they tend to notice something that marketers sometimes underestimate, which is curiosity. When a marketer asks a sales rep, well, what questions have buyers been asking you lately? Or what objections are you hearing most often? Or, where do your deals get stuck? Sales reps appreciate that more than marketers realize because someone is finally paying attention to what they are doing all day long. And those conversations can be incredibly enlightening for a marketer. Sometimes a single insight from a sales rep can reshape an entire campaign. And sales doesn't automatically walk in trusting marketing, and honestly, that's fair. Their world revolves around pipeline and revenue. And when marketing shows up talking about campaigns and engagement metrics, it doesn't feel connected to what they're dealing with. But something happens when marketing starts helping in a way that impacts deals and impacts their world. Maybe marketing notices that buyers are confused about something and they clarify the story, they clarify their messaging. Or maybe we build a piece of content that helps to answer one of those tough questions that the prospect keeps asking. Or maybe they sit in on enough calls that they start spotting patterns. When that kind of collaboration happens, the sales and marketing relationship starts to shift, and sales starts to see marketing as someone who actually does understand their world. And when that happens, trust will start to build and it will start to build quickly. So when we partner together, both teams get smarter. Sales can understand what the strategy is behind our campaigns, and we can understand what's actually happening in the buying process. You see better alignment in conversations, you see better feedback loops. And I think leadership really starts noticing the difference too. And there's also a personal reason why all of this matters. Sales sits very close to revenue, and revenue is the language that the leadership team speaks. The marketers who really understand how the deals actually happen naturally start thinking about the business that way. They're thinking about the business differently, and they're starting to ask better questions, and they're starting to connect what they're doing on an activity level to actual business outcomes. And those are the marketers who end up getting invited to bigger conversations about strategy and about growth. Because once you understand how customers buy, you're no longer thinking about marketing. You are thinking about the business. And if you want to strengthen your partnership with sales, try something simple. Just ask the sales rep if you can listen in on a few calls. Just listen. Don't critique. Don't don't even analyze, right away. Just pay attention. And I'm sure you're going to end up hearing something that surprises you. It's going to be an insight that maybe changes how you approach your next campaign. So, the one idea I'm going to leave you with is this: becoming sales's favorite marketer is not about trying to keep the sales team happy. It's about being curious enough to understand how customers actually make decisions. Sales sits on the front lines of those conversations every single day. And when marketers take the time to learn from that, from their frontline work, our work as marketers becomes sharper, it becomes more relevant, and it becomes so much more connected to the business. And over time, it doesn't just make you a better partner to sales, it makes you a better marketer. Thank you so much for listening. This has been Spark Sessions. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you got something out of it. If you did, please consider giving it a review and subscribing to my channel. I'll see you next time.